Now we would like to welcome Lesley Green. If you could turn your video on and so on.
Hello.
Great. Lesley Green, who is Professor of Anthropology and Director of Environmental Humanities South at the University of Cape Town, and currently a Cheney Visiting Research Fellow at the School of Earth and Environment in Leeds in the UK. She will talk to us about the False Bay Coast of Cape Town, a critical zone.
Thank you, Meredith. Let me just share my screen. And now make that the slideshow play from start. There we go. You got that?
Yep.
Yeah, well, thank you very, very much to the organizers, to the funders, and to all of you who are joining us. I want to talk to you today about the challenges of thinking through the immense mess that we have in a periphery of Cape Town. And so in this image, like a screenshot from Minecraft, this landscape is a periphery of Cape Town in Google Earth. Cape Town, the city that almost ran out of water in 2018, is usually presented with picture postcard perfection to the global tourist market. It's Africa's piece of Europe. The back slopes of Table Mountain on your left are the city's famous landmark. But these slopes are unfamiliar to tourists for whom our city has long been managed and who disappeared in 2020, the year of COVID and travel bans. To the right, the hills that ring Table Bay in the Atlantic Ocean. Underfoot, the sands of the Cape Flats that not too long ago was under the Indian Ocean when carbon levels were as high as they are now. What's the future of this lunar landscape? This online abstraction, flattened out and exiled from ground level view. Its violence, its hunger, and its xenophobia made it too dangerous for Google Earth Pegman and his Street View car. So how does such a ground level view exist in such a periphery? Let's pull back into the sky, and let me add some stories to the pixels. At 177 meters up, corrugated iron roofs sparkle like a Mondrian mosaic. At 500 meters in altitude, the scale of the shacks becomes clearer by comparison. This is a shanty suburb without trees, an anti-arboretum without a speck of green, where street life is on dank, dark mud mixed with effluent, rendering all vulnerable to viruses and bacteria. A pandemic long before COVID of tuberculosis, HIV, asthma. Every home can burn in one night from one fallen candle or one sparking illegal electrical connection. Social distancing would be a dream for those who live here amid the violence of crowds. So too would be frequent hand washing in homes without taps. People sleep in shifts when there's work. At 1,000 meters up, Google Earth tells us its name. Vrygrond means free ground, or perhaps free dim ground. But to the north in this image, come to view the ganglands of Lavender Hill, an apartheid dormitory for those whom apartheid scientists classified colored, descendants of the Kwe who fought the Dutch settlers in the 1600s and who died in smallpox epidemics by 1710 or left. They too are descendants of slaves from Batavia and West Africa and Mozambique, descendants of slave masters, survivors of the genocide of the San. The parks of Lavender Hill are corridors to the M5, that large road on your left, the route to jobs, shops, or hustles, unsafe for children. Police gunshot detectors register some of the highest rates of gunshots in the country. In this piece of the Cape Flats, with the highest murder rates in this city, which has one of the highest murder rates in the world. There are no urban farms here. Backyards are places for more shacks to earn a rental income or accommodate a family member. Space for plants is a luxury. And yet, to the east is a pocket of False Bay Nature Reserve, frequently invaded by those desperate for space to build shelter. In the ongoing competition of people and ecology, removal of land invaders is now a privatized industry. The apartheid state in Cape Town had a waiting list for around 7,000 homes. The current city, in the time of freedom, has an official waiting list of 17,000. The unofficial housing requirements, estimated by a housing activist forum, are over 40,000 homes. Many whose desperation has led them to build in this extraterrestrial zone of Google Street View are climate refugees, displaced by waves of drought on the east coast of Africa, from Somalia, Malawi, Zimbabwe, and South Africa's Eastern Cape Province. The militarized responses they receive from city authorities may be a harbinger of the militarization of climate governance that is to come. If environmental governance continues to rely on fences and guns and market-led solutions that use credit cards to open or close the gates of the city to sell basic services to citizens or deny them. As our viewpoint soars up to 3,000 meters, the brutalism of Capitalocene Cape Town is in full view. On the left, in the west, is Marina de Gama, an upmarket waterfront estate plagued by crime and sewage spills. In the center, south of Vrygrond, is Capricorn, the lake that looks like a sea goat, surrounded by a high security manufacturing park and a shopping center. Even before COVID lockdown, an estimated 40% of Cape Townians went to bed hungry. The figures would have been far higher here, without commonage for food production, without jobs or documents to open bank accounts, and with open lands fenced for nature. How are people to survive? The answer here is in the east, on your right, in the face that looks like a grumpy bureaucrat, which is the Capricorn solid waste dump, to which the southern city's waste is trucked daily. It towers over the flat surrounds, a replica of Table Mountain, daily built ever higher by the mechanized sedimentation of suburban detritus. The prevailing southeaster wind takes the dust of the wealthy into the air of Vrygrond and into the surrounding nature reserve. Respiratory illnesses are legion. Further east of the waste dump, on your far right, is the beginnings of the False Bay sewage treatment plant, a favored destination of birds and birders. At 40 kilometers up, the Cape Flats shows up as a valley between mountains and oceans. At 500 kilometers up, False Bay is a small alcove tucked in between Cape Town's peninsula on the southwest shores of Africa. Diving back in to 7 kilometers on a cold winter day, where the icy clouds of the Cape winter reflect in the water of Capricorn the goat, in the wagon wheel of the sewage plant. In the center, at the top, is a lake known as Zekufle, or Hippo Lake. I live on the little peninsula in the middle of that. Zekufle is registered with UNESCO as a Ramsar site, a site protected by international agreement as a wetland way stop for migrating birds. Yearly, stilts arrive here from Siberia. Swifts have flown the 11 or 12,000 kilometers from Europe. Rare Southern African birds are in abundance: pelicans, flamingos, red bishops, bee-eaters, pin-tailed whydahs, fork-tailed drongos, sparrow-tailed hawks, Cape barn owls, even a breeding pair of fish eagles that we generally hear over morning coffee at around 11. Along with otters, and water mongoose, Cape cobras, puff adders, and the boomslang, the tree snake, along with porcupines. Ringing the lake is a green area. Ringing the lake and the sewage plant and Vrygrond and the dump site is this false bay nature reserve. A manifestation of the idea that ecosystem services will clean up the Anthropocene. The lakes you see here are the eastern edge of the Cape Flats aquifer, fed by several small rivers. The groundwater that pops up in them takes 30 years to travel through the sandstone formations of Table Mountain before surfacing atop a layer of impermeable granite and then sinking into the aquifer itself. So the rain that fell on Table Mountain last week will pop up in this lake in the year that my 18-year-old son turns 48. At the top right corner is an agricultural area that feeds the whole city and recharges the aquifer. This zone is the primary recharge zone of that aquifer on which the city will depend in future droughts. But that aquifer water is heavily polluted by heavy metals from the waste dump and persistent organic pollutants from the sewage. Finally, in the lower right corner of this image is one tiny sparkling pool, the Strandfontein Beach Pool, and adjoining that is the Strandfontein desalination plant that failed spectacularly in Cape Town's infamous drought of 2018-19. Now you see it, now you don't. Part of a R1 billion solution to the lack of water. This is one of 3 desalination plants that failed to supply a steady stream of water to the city when it most needed it. The reason for that is that the water offshore is so polluted by sewage spills, and in some cases, sewage sent directly to sea. In the image, you can see exactly where those pipes are, where the algae bloom is at its most intense. Polluted groundwater runoff too, from rivers to which excess sewage is piped. These excess algal blooms overwhelmed the desalination plant's filtration systems. In the dry, hot summer months of December to February, when the city's need for water was at its greatest, these plants, 3 of them, could not function. Costly maintenance was undertaken, adjustment of the treatment system, replacement of the filters, but all 3 plants closed shop before the end of their 2-year contract. And one of those 3 is heading for a court battle later this year. The failure of those desalination plants underscores quite simply that there is no end-of-pipe solution in urban ecologies. The inability of the city of Cape Town to find a suitable site for any desalination plants on its 300 kilometers of coastline, all the way around that peninsula, around that large false bay, is an indication that what we thought all along was the periphery is not the periphery, it is at the center. We thought we could pipe wastewater into the sea. The end of our pipes is on this planet where we live. We are not quasi-extraterrestrials. Our waste stays on this planet. We live with it or we die in it. This section of Cape Town was designed for urban excreta, but the paradigm has failed. The contaminants are not corralled by law, by policy, by property boundaries, or policing. Refuse refuses the fence. When winds blow and rains fall, heavy metals from batteries and e-wastes and mercury from light bulbs enter the streams. Sewage pollution enters the air when the mud dries and the wind blows. Its contents enter the groundwater and then the aquifer. My colleagues in environmental chemistry and hydrogeology have demonstrated time and again that the aquifer and the ocean are contaminated by chemicals of emerging concern that are bioaccumulating in fish and birds, in sediments and waters, and by implication, humans too. Now that groundwater waters the city's food in the Philippine horticultural area. Many farmers also collect sludge from sewage plants around the city as cheap fertilizer for the fields, even though this is outlawed. And even though Cape Town's sewage treatment plants offer no tertiary treatment that would remove chemicals that are listed by the UN Environmental Programme as chemicals of emerging concern, with timeframes to outlaw them globally. Out in the open environment, those contaminants do not break down. They travel with evaporated water high into the atmosphere to other countries, to other continents, to other oceans. They do not break down. They will be with us in geological time as far forward as the time of the Neanderthals is behind us, 30 to 40,000 years. In February 2000, that waste dump, the face of the grumpy bureaucrat, looked like this. It was a sand dune at an elevation of around 7 meters. On your right, you'll see a small lake. Let me just get this. Sorry, there we go. Sand mining, some 7 months later, had released a small lake, formed a small groundwater lake at around 4 meters above sea level. 8 years later, the waste of the city had been terraced. Keep your eye on that little lake on the right. The same spot, another year later, with thousands of dump truck loads from suburban streets awaiting bulldozing. By 2018, methane vents had been installed, those spots that you see, to reduce the risk of a catastrophic dump fire that might last for decades. The dump is now 12 to 15 meters high, and still the trucks roll in, as do the pelicans and the seagulls and the ibises looking for a quick meal amid the groaning, roaring, and creaking of big yellow monsters flattening the city's sediments. December 2019, a shrine to consumerism, to thoughtless product design, to a new era of rare earth metals in e-wastes, in a city whose legacy of land dispossession has birthed generations of citizens who live without thought to urban metabolism, lies this monstrous monument of the Anthropocene. Its solid wastes entering air and water alike, a kilometer away from where I'm sitting right now, flicked with blue council-issued plastic garbage bags. Our dystopia is picked over by waste pickers from Vrygrond shack settlement and breathed in their homes when the southeaster blows, and in mine in the southwester. In 2020, after the city issued a tender to a private company to recycle waste, the waste pickers from Vrygrond, who had done that for a long time, were evicted and set the dump alight in protest. A few tense days followed, with thick, toxic smoke billowing across the southern shores through the nature reserve. A Cape cobra took shelter from the smoke in an underground gutter pipe in our family garden. The acrid burning of plastics caught the throats of all. We breathed the elements of the knowledge economy. Who knows what, were there headaches from chromium, cobalt, iron, titanium, mercury, aluminium, lithium, antimony, arsenic, beryllium, cadmium, indium, lead, nickel, or thallium? And which of the plastics burned our throats and eyes? In our air and in our lungs were sedimenting elements from deep underground, from all over the geology of our earth. The waste dump is a shrine to the signature philosophy of the Anthropocene, an overweening faith in fences, concrete, pipes, and law to keep solid waste solid and liquid waste liquid. Novelist Amitav Ghosh calls this not the Anthropocene, but the Great Derangement. Our policies for water and waste management are designed for solids, liquids, and gases. The great chemical and pharmaceutical industries of our time leach, flow, aggregate, metabolize, sediment, and bioaccumulate in bodies and soils and food systems. The mingling of states of matter here in this periphery of Cape Town is central to life processes in the whole of the city. When matters of state focus only on states of matter, unable to see the flows between them, we engineer a material problem. Urban design has been framed and taught, graduated and rewarded with little thought to flows. Homo sapiens does not understand herself as Homo sedimenta, sediment-forming human. Anthropos, the man of the world who controls matter objectively, is the face of this dump site at False Bay. This picture has not been altered. Anthropos is the Zeus of our time, the face of the great derangement. Anthropos faces too away from the sewage plant behind him, to which every toilet pipe in about a third of the city leads. Anthropos believes that ecosystem services in the nature reserve will clean the air and the water and the soil at minimal cost to the fiscus. And a bonus, the nature reserve will serve as a buffer between rich and poor, white and black, between citizens and stateless denizens, whose hopes make bearable the terrors of living undocumented. Anthropos markets the dogma of Homo economicus, the idea that the market will self-regulate, that GDP targeting governance will spontaneously trickle down and release the poor from their burdens. The monstrousness of Anthropos is the trickle down of money did not come from tourists. Instead, the trickle down is toxic, a trickle down of heavy metals, of environmental contaminants that add to the disease burden and the hunger burden and the violence of this most violent city in the world. Anthropos denies his ecological violence, his urban ecopathology. Anthropos will not see that the herd is not immune if one goat receives treatment while others fall ill. The prevailing paradigm of environmental governance has failed in this piece of Cape Town, as it has elsewhere in the world. It is focused on particular measurables, like E. coli counts, that become bureaucratic mandates, and in turn, bureaucratic mantras. While the big picture of flows and movements of toxins and nutrients between life and non-life, between solids, liquid, and gas, and between soil and society remain invisible. It is so easy to lie with science when science and evidence are limited to the bureaucratic mandate. When environmental governance is reduced to a bureaucratic mandate, it is no longer able to see what it counts, nor is it able to see what counts. Government scientists and contract scientists can only count what they're told to count. So when the crisis of water hit Cape Town, the emergency measures like the desalination plant failed because the idea of governing only by measurables has not produced the evidence necessary to warn us of the crisis that we could not see coming. What paradigms are emerging in transdisciplinary scholarship that might be useful? In engineering, the field of industrial ecology has emerged as a response to the absence in social ecological systems of the idea of infrastructure. Biogeochemistry heralds a paradigm shift that has made it possible to connect life and non-life, biosciences and earth sciences. That approach has been central to the emergence of a new field called critical zone studies, where earth sciences and biosciences have converged to explore what makes life possible at any point on the surface of the earth, where life emerges in the fragile relations between bedrock and treetop in that place, in that tiny, thin zone of soil, water, air, and biota, and their constant exchanges, sedimentations, metabolites, excreta, and flows. A transformative environmental governance would be what anthropologist Eduardo Viveros de Castro calls an anthropocenography. Social sciences as earth science and bioscience simultaneously. Not a biogeochemistry, but a biogeosocial chemistry. Critical zone studies explores those relations, although generally in pristine environments without humans. The work of Bruno Latour and Peter Weibel in their recent book and exhibition has been to explore those relations as political relations, as problems of political ecology, conceptualization, and governance. Both look at the planet, not like Google Earth with its God's eye view as we do here, or even from a street view, which remains the view of the human, stitched together in the geometry of the cone, perpetually coming towards you. In the middle here are two images of my university campus, one offering a standard street view, the other offering a view from the ground outwards, stitched together in a hyperbolic geometry that opens it up like a flower. Here the ground in the black and white image is not at the bottom, but in the center. A version of the critical zones approach framed by Bruno Latour, Jérôme Gallaudet, and Alexandre Arène is that to understand and govern a landscape for the purpose of making life and well-being possible, in order to accomplish that, what is needed is not a map, like a property map from the God's eye view, but a map of its processes and metabolic relations to map what nutrients and elements, waters and contaminants are flowing through air, water, soils, and life. The soil map of the critical zone by Tuati, Arène, and Grégoire from their new book Terraformer puts the sky at the center, the inversion of the image of the university that I showed you just now. And the soil from bedrock is at the edges. What this map does is map the flows of water and nutrients through the soil out into the sky, and from the sky back down into the soil again. Imagine the productive science, governance, policy relationship that is possible when material flows, not boundaries, of property or territory, when material flows are at the center of the discussion about how to remediate damaged landscapes. What this contribution does is recenter earthly relations of the commons. It takes our view away from property and territory, from the view of the Capitalocene. The gaze of Anthropos has for so long told us there is no alternative. And yet, there's an entire body of work in the environmental humanities, in visual arts like Terraformer of Alexandra Arène and her colleagues, and literature like that of Amitav Ghosh, thinking about the Great Derangement. Their approaches appear to us surreal because they challenge the terms in which the real has been represented. On your right is the cover of photographer Peter Hugo's book, Permanent Error, which photographs the global e-waste dump in Agbogbloshie in Ghana. Like Arène and Ghosh and Latour, Hugo's work calls for attention to realities that are not available to those who have dominated the discussion on what to count and how to count it. These artists and writers focus on flows in and out and through geology, bodies, and ecologies. Their work is a radical departure from social ecological systems which fail to include the technosphere within the relations of atmosphere, pedosphere, and hydrosphere. Much of their work is like a scream, like Edvard Munch's famous painting. We think it cannot be happening, and yet it is. Other writers, like Michel Serres, the far right, his book Biogea, speak to the integration of bios and geos. On your far left, Jason Moore's concept of the Capitalocene tracks capitalism's effort to control the web of life. Next to that, in ecofeminism, as Frida Neumanus's book, Bodies of Water, thinks about flows of water in and through earth and bodies, and what that means as a feminist. In urban studies, the fields that have emerged to think differently include urban ecology and sustainable urban metabolism, focusing on the transformations and metabolites of chemicals and compounds in the environments we put them in. In engineering, industrial ecology has emerged. In decolonial work, soil care was long central to the work and the political activism of thinkers who were working in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, Amilcar Cabral, Wangari Maathai, Aimé Césaire. Their response to the colonials was, you can't thingify the world, you need to focus on the relations. Césaire's famous quote, colonization is thingification, speaks to the impossibility of thinking about a world in the terms of particular objects as countable things. As if he was saying a long time ago in his poetry, you cannot measure what counts in your terms of thingifying things. You must focus on relations. The great contribution of Caribbean social sciences, where Césaire was working, was to think about relationships between things, central to decolonial scholarship. And yet, notwithstanding all of that extraordinary range of work in the humanities, the arts, engineering, urban planning, microbiology, the convergence of earth sciences and biosciences, what we do not yet have is a linking of social sciences with natural sciences in a manner that can offer the many city officials that I've come to know and come to respect, even while I disagree with them. The officials that I've come to know are quite unlike their political bosses who only know blame and aversion in response to the devastation of flows they wish to deny. The officials I know care. They simply do not have a paradigm that they can translate into defensible bureaucratic mandates to justify their decisions as good governance. That, I want to suggest, is the work we need to do today and going forward. The work of Arène and Latour and Gallaudet, Steve Bannon, and their proposal is simply this, that by tracking the commons, that is the earthly relationship of rock and water, air and life, it will be possible to advance justice and ecological well-being jointly rather than in competition with one another or as compensation one for the other. The critical zone approach begins to offer a method in these visual arts in the book Terraformer by Arène and her colleagues to track the dissolutions that sediment daily into our soils in ways that the earth has not known before. Politically, that work attends to the commons, not to private property or territory, but to the flows that make possible life on earth in each place. Politically, it's critical to have a science that speaks to this, that is solid enough in which we can govern. That work builds on biogeosciences, and at the same time it calls for biogeosocial sciences, a field that does not yet exist, that can equip us to generate new strategies of urban governance that partners with earthly flows instead of fighting them with fences like Don Quixote fighting the wind and fighting the windmill. COVID vaccine science has done the impossible in a matter of months to develop vaccines and begin to roll them out globally. Can we take inspiration from them and begin together to build a scholarly commons that links bio-geo-social sciences to work together as quickly, as collaboratively, and even more generously to share our experiments in methods and what we are learning about approaches to healing the wounded and degraded landscapes in which we live. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lesley, for this extremely interesting presentation. So for everyone who would like to ask questions, we have about 15 minutes for questions. You can write them. The only way to ask questions is to write them in the Q&A. And then I will read them. So while everyone is formulating your questions, as I hope you will do, I'll start with a question that I have, and possibly Alexa or someone else may also jump in with one. What really struck me, well, first of all, I wanted to say that I don't know if you were aware that we're also going to be talking to Axel Grégoire, one of the authors of the Terra Forma book. Mm-hmm. So that's a really nice coincidence, and I'm glad that you brought up this book, which is really interesting. So she'll be in one of the panel sessions this afternoon with me, actually.
Wonderful.
Yes. Mm. And we'll be looking at some of the extension of that project that she's been working on. So it's a really nice link. Also, I think I was very interested by the way time came into your talk. So there were many different temporal scales as well as the spatial scales. Mm. There was the very long, or in geological terms, not very long, but the 30-year trickling of the water through the rock. And then, and then the 20,000 years it takes to degrade some of the chemicals and so on, contrasted against this extremely rapid shifting in the territory of the dump and the urgency of the social problems. It made me want to ask: is it right, or is it somehow a bias to imagine that human affairs are inherently faster than these biogeo cycles, or is there a kind of a long durée of the social that we should be thinking about?
That's a fascinating question, Meredith. By way of answer, I'd like to tell a short story, if I may. About 2 decades ago, I was working in the Amazon, working with some archaeologists. And at the time, the Brazilian government was paying for generators, electrical generators, to come into the villages. And the fridge, the refrigerator, became part of life for those who could afford it. Generally, those who had some cattle and could sell off to buy a refrigerator. And I was astonished to see, in a very short space of time, talking 2-3 years, transformation of the social structure of the village from the ability to control time that the refrigerator introduces. The refrigerator, as the great preservative, means that you can go and shoot 10 howler monkeys instead of just one, because you can preserve it. You're not bound by the time scale of rotting. It means that you don't need to share with your neighbor because you've got food for tomorrow. You're sorted, And so very quickly, a class structure was introduced. It wasn't not a focus of my research, but I was fascinated by the extent to which modernist life equips us and enables us to control time. Preservatives, the cold chain, all of these are about controlling biological timescales. And I think one of the great illusions of modernity is that we can control timeframes, ecological timeframes. And, earth scientists are reminding us constantly that we are just, we only arrived on this planet in Earth time, sort of a couple of seconds to midnight. And yet we live as if we live outside of time. And so I think that's an interesting point, and I think that one of the roots to sustainable living has really been focusing on space. And yet one of the key roots to sustainable living is to learn to work with time frames. I mean, chemical preservatives are one of the great toxins of our time. So yes, I mean, I think time learning to work not only with space, but learning to work in partnership with time is key.
Great. Yes, thank you. There are several questions now, so let's see if we can do a few of them. Someone who's anonymous says, thanks for the great points about scholarship. How can interdisciplinary scholar collaborations better engage and transform governmental structures, especially in a moment when many governments are becoming less interested in expertise? Do you want to? Yeah.
Yes. I think that's, again, such a fascinating question. And again, what's so critical is for a serious engagement of the social sciences with the forms of science that are currently advising governance. One of the things that greatly concerns me is the extent to which scientific advice in matters of governance, whether we're dealing with COVID or whether we're dealing with conservation, that scientific advice often goes down the route of policing, of militarizing, of forcing compliance. The approach is often quite fascist, frankly. If you look at the ways in which matters of science are conveyed to the public, you will agree with me, because this is the science, and I'm terribly sorry, but you just have to do what I say. And I think that one of the enormous difficulties with the current framing of climate science and climate negotiations globally is that it is at the level of intergovernmental agreements. But all of those government officials have to go home and survive the next election. And that's not been happening. So that's not just because necessarily because governments are less interested in science, but I think that there's something very important that's not happening in the scientific community. They're not thinking carefully about appropriate forms of politics. So the fence and the gun and the law and one-way systems of education, you will do as I say. And I think we're setting ourselves up in that way of doing science and society for a militarized climate future, where there will be enormous dissent from the science, not because it's necessarily bad science, but because it's got bad relations. It's like having a patriarch that you hate in the household, because he's always telling you what to do. You want to be able to discuss and debate and think. One size doesn't fit all. So one of the key things that needs to be happening is for the social sciences to be able to frame the kinds of questions that are being asked. A quick point in that regard is many climate scientists in Africa advise that GM seeds are the way to go because they're engineered to be drought resistant. Well, whether or not we agree with the genetic modification, that's not my point. The point is that those genetic modifications come with patents. And the patents, when they're rolled out on the ground, criminalize farmers when the wind blows. How absurd is that? That when the wind blows and the pollen goes with it, a farmer can be criminalized. If that's not a concern to the scientist, it's not an appropriate real-world intervention. And I could add a number of other examples to that. So for example, in Malawi, what we've seen, and I'm working with a wonderful graduate student, Henry Tambala, on this, is that because the seeds don't reproduce themselves, they're engineered to protect their patent and not reproduce themselves, capitalism in the web of life. People need cash to buy the next year's seeds. How do they get that? Where our graduate student lives, people get that by making charcoal from the forest. The end result is you've got cutting down of the forest, you've got excess smoke, and the result has been that the seed that was introduced to reduce vulnerability to drought has caused drought because, and I'm sure we'll hear similar ideas from John Liu later today, because your water table has dropped because the trees are gone. So there's an absolutely critical need for significant engagements with the social sciences, and particularly with decolonial voices who are speaking to the different kinds of concerns and the ways in which different kinds of concerns can be addressed in the in scientific research. So I think it's a complex answer, but it's got to come from both sides. It's not just simply that governments must, be marketed science better, but there needs to be a much stronger relationship, an attentive relationship between science and scientific interventions and democratic process.
Thank you, Lesley. We have several questions. I'd like to do one of them that's been written in French. Lesley, do you want to switch quickly to the English interpretation? I'll read it out.
I can't see where that is.
You should have at the bottom a thing that says interpretation, or interpretation is available. Then you can pick the channel.
Okay.
Okay, so I'll read it in French. Donc c'est Eric Verdet, qui est un des personnes qui va présenter plus tard aujourd'hui. Il a dit merci de cette passionnante intervention. Elle insiste beaucoup sur les forces de mort et à juste titre. Mais pour essayer de transformer la situation, ne faut-il pas essayer de suivre ces formes de vie en zone critique, réfléchir aux formes de suivi et aux arrangements politiques, si injustes ou insuffisantes soient-ils, parce que ce sont probablement seulement des initiatives locales réactives qui peuvent changer graduellement les choses, plus que de rêver à un changement radical qui viendrait d'en haut. Qu'en pensez-vous, même si je suis conscient d'être un peu provocant?
So, if I'm correct, then the question speaks to how do we focus on life, not just the forces of death, the necropolitics. Mm-hmm. And you're correct. I mean, this is, in a sense, a necropolitical ethnography that I'm offering to try to understand the necropolitics that are built into the city. Working with Anat Singh and the others, yes, absolutely. One of the ways that we need to work is to work with microbes, for example, to look at remediation of these soils, the capacity of various mushrooms to take up heavy metals or rare earths. These are the only kinds of solutions that I see. We're at the beginning of a large project that does that, and I think your question is exactly on the right track, that these kinds of nature-based solutions where we are working in partnership with nature rather than relying on nature as a zone behind a fence is precisely the way to go. If I've missed some of your question, please feel free to come back.
I think, well, we're right on time now to finish, actually. So unfortunately, we won't get to all of the questions, but we'll try to keep the questions and possibly see if we can do something with them afterwards. But anyway, thank you very much, Lesley, for that extremely interesting talk, which we all enjoyed very much, I think. And so now, if I'm not mistaken, we have a quick break and then we will be back. Am I correct? Yes, I believe so. We have a quick break and then we will be back with Simone Farisin.
Lovely.
Thank you.